The Ashbourne estate glittered beneath the afternoon sun, its gardens alive with laughter, silk, and the rustle of parasols. It should have been Lady Evelina Ashbourne's proudest moment, her engagement celebration to Lord Henry Marlowe, a match that would secure her family's fortune and her place among London's elite. Music floated through the rose-scented air, and Evelina's cheeks glowed with quiet joy. Yet beneath the layers of lace and charm, she felt the faint tremor of unease, like the warning note before a storm. Her cousin Clara, sharp-eyed and bitter from envy, lingered at the edge of every group, whispering to guests with a smile too sweet to be sincere. Evelina ignored it. She wanted to believe in goodness, but innocence, in the court of society, was the first luxury to be stripped away. When the carriage from London arrived bearing an urgent letter, all chatter hushed. Lord Marlowe read the paper once, twice, his face draining of colour. The sheet trembled in his hand as he turned to her. "Is this your writing?" he demanded, voice loud enough to draw every gaze. Evelina's heart stuttered. "My writing? What?" He flung the page toward her. The ink was hers, the signature perfect, the content ruinous. A confession of secret meetings with another man, a promise to elope. Gasps rippled through the garden like wind through reeds. She tried to speak, but her throat closed. "It's forged," she whispered. No one listened. Lord Marlowe's mother clutched her pearls. Her father's eyes turned to steel. The orchestra fell silent. Within minutes, gossip spread faster than any flame. The laughter died. Her father stepped forward, each word cutting deeper than the last. "You have shamed this family. Pack your things." Evelina's knees nearly buckled. She looked for compassion in the faces around her, the friends who had once shared secrets and laughter, but saw only fear of contamination. Society fed on scandal like wolves on blood. Within an hour, her engagement was annulled. By nightfall, she was ordered to leave the house she had grown up in. Rain began to fall as she walked down the gravel path, the roses bowing under silver drops. The servants watched from behind curtains, whispering. Her white gown clung to her skin, once a symbol of purity, now marked by mud. She did not cry. Tears would give her tormentors satisfaction. Instead, she looked back once at the glittering windows of the ballroom where her life had collapsed and whispered, "You may take my name, but not my soul." London the next day was merciless. Every paper hinted at the fallen Lady Ashbourne, the girl who had dared deceive her betrothed. Invitations vanished. Acquaintances crossed the street to avoid her. Even the charities she had supported returned her letters unopened. For society, she was no longer a person, only a cautionary tale whispered over tea. Her father's funds were cut off. She sold her jewels, keeping only a small locket with her late mother's portrait. On the third morning, she left the city in a rented carriage with a single trunk and no destination. The countryside welcomed her not with grandeur, but with silence. Endless green fields stretched beneath grey skies, promising anonymity. At a coastal village called Wexmoor, the driver stopped, saying the road ended there. Evelina stepped out, her boots sinking into damp earth. The sea wind tangled her hair and tasted of salt and freedom. For the first time since her disgrace, she breathed without fear of eyes watching. She rented a tiny cottage with crumbling walls and a garden of wild lavender. At night, she mended her one remaining gown by candlelight. By day, she helped the local children read and carried baskets of herbs to the sick. Slowly, the villagers began to smile at her, not as a fallen lady, but as one of their own. Yet even as peace brushed the edges of her heart, loneliness clung to her like fog. She sometimes dreamed of the life she had lost, the echo of waltzes, the glitter of chandeliers, and woke with tears she pretended not to shed. Still she endured. The scandal that had shattered her world had also tempered her spirit. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, rumours spoke of a grand estate, hidden in the woods, its master unseen for years, a duke so reclusive that even the bravest courtiers spoke his name in whispers. Evelina dismissed the tales as gossip carried by sea wind. She had no more interest in nobility, in titles, in men who bowed only to reputation. Yet fate, patient and ironic, was already writing the next chapter of her story, a chapter that would begin not with scorn, but with the quiet thunder of hooves on a storm-lit night. Days blurred into months, and months into the slow rhythm of years. Wexmoor village became her quiet refuge, a small pocket of life far removed from the glittering deceit of London. The air smelled of salt and wild thyme, the cries of gulls echoing above grey cliffs. Lady Evelina Ashbourne, though no one called her that any more, was known simply as Miss Eve. The children adored her, gathering around her small cottage every morning with slates and chalk, their laughter a melody that softened her solitude. She taught them to read, to dream beyond the fishing nets and stormy coasts, and in return they filled her world with the innocent light she thought she had lost. Yet even as she smiled, a quiet ache lived in her chest, the ache of a life half-lived, of letters unwritten and music unplayed. Sometimes, on evenings when the sky turned to molten gold, Evelina would stand on the cliff's edge, watching ships drift toward the horizon. She would wonder if anyone in London ever thought of her. Did Lord Marlowe, the man who had once sworn eternal devotion, ever regret the way he had turned away from her in that dreadful garden? Did her father ever miss the daughter he had exiled for the sake of appearances? The sea never answered, only whispered in its eternal tongue of longing and distance. The villagers, protective of her gentle spirit, never pried into her past. They saw her as a quiet angel of mercy who helped birth their children, wrote their letters, and visited the sick without hesitation. To them, she was grace without title. Yet whispers persisted of the solitary man who lived deep in the northern woods, the Duke of Blackthorn, master of Wexmoor Hall. None in the village had seen him in years. His servants came to the market once a month, buying supplies in silence, their coats bearing the faded crest of a raven in flight. The old women said he was cursed, that his halls were haunted by the ghost of his dead wife. The young ones imagined him as a monster with a broken face. Evelina laughed at such tales, though her heart, for reasons she could not name, stirred when she heard them. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the sea, fierce and sudden. Rain lashed the thatched roofs and thunder growled like an angry beast. Evelina rushed to bring in her washing when she heard the sharp neigh of a frightened horse. Looking up, she saw a black stallion galloping down the muddy road, riderless, wild-eyed and wounded. Without a second thought, she ran toward it. The creature stumbled, collapsing near her gate, its flank bleeding. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice low and steady as she tore her shawl to bind the wound. The horse trembled, but did not strike. She worked through the storm, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her hands steady despite the cold. When the thunder quieted, she heard the crunch of boots behind her. "Step away from the horse," a deep voice commanded. She turned. A tall figure stood cloaked in black, the hood dripping with rain. His presence was almost otherworldly, commanding, silent, heavy with an energy that made her breath catch. His gloved hand rested on the hilt of a sword, his tone more warning than gratitude. "It's my horse," he said, eyes shadowed. "I gathered as much," Evelina replied. meeting his gaze without flinching. "He's injured. If you wish him to live, you'll let me finish." For a moment, he said nothing. Rain pattered between them. Then, with the smallest nod, he stepped aside. She tied the last knot, checked the creature's breathing, and only then looked up fully at the man before her. His face, partially hidden beneath the hood, was sharply cut. Strong jaw, dark stubble, eyes the color of storm clouds. He was perhaps in his 30s, though his expression carried the weight of someone far older. "Who are you?" he asked finally.
"Evelina,"
she said simply, leaving out her surname as if it no longer belonged to her. He studied her, his gaze unreadable. "Most people around here don't interfere with my property." "Most people," she said quietly, "don't stop to help a wounded soul, man or beast." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, not irritation, but something softer, almost human. Without another word, he lifted the reins of his horse and mounted. "You'll be hearing from me," he said, before riding into the rain, disappearing into the grey. Evelina stood in silence, the wind whipping her skirts, wondering if she had just met the ghost of Wexmore himself. That night she could not sleep. The storm had passed, leaving only the rhythmic whisper of waves. She replayed his voice in her mind, cold yet compelling, distant yet strangely familiar. There was something about him, something broken that mirrored her own scars. When she finally drifted into restless sleep, she dreamed of dark halls and candlelight, of a man standing alone in an endless corridor, looking out over the sea. And though she could not see his face, she knew instinctively it was him, the reclusive Duke, the man who would soon ask her a question that would change the course of both their lives forever. Wexmore Hall rose from the mist like a memory carved in stone, vast, silent, and half consumed by ivy. It stood on the edge of the northern cliffs where the sea crashed endlessly below, a fortress both of wealth and sorrow. Inside its candlelit corridors walked a man who had long forgotten the warmth of laughter. Duke Adrian Blackthorne had once been the darling of London, charming, intelligent, his name whispered at every ball. Women admired his wit, men envied his power. But all that had changed the day love betrayed him. Now the grand hallways echoed only with the sound of his boots and the restless ticking of clocks that no one dared to wind. He was not old, barely 35, but grief had aged him more than time could. His hair, once dark gold, now bore silver threads at the temples. His eyes, cold and grey as winter steel, carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much of human deceit. Servants moved quietly in his presence, their footsteps careful, their words few. They spoke in whispers about the tragedy that had turned him into the phantom of his own estate. His beloved wife, Lady Cassandra, found lifeless beside the pond under the willows. The scandal that followed was enough to shatter him completely. Some said she had fallen by accident. Others believed she had taken her own life after betraying him with another man. The Duke never confirmed nor denied the rumours. He simply closed the grand gates of Wexmore Hall and dismissed half his staff, vowing never again to open his doors to the world that had watched his ruin with fascination. Years passed. Invitations piled in dust. The London season came and went without his name. Even his own mother, the Dowager Duchess, had stopped writing after he returned her letters unopened. His only companions were the hounds in the courtyard and the paintings of ancestors whose faces judged him silently from the walls. He had learned to find comfort in solitude. "People lie," he would say to his steward, "but silence never does." Yet the memory of his wife's eyes haunted him. How easily trust could turn to treachery. He had loved once, and in that love had lost all sense of self. Never again, he swore, never again would a woman wield power over him. He buried his heart beneath discipline and command, and then, days ago, a storm had brought him face to face with a stranger, Evelina. The memory of her lingered like a stubborn echo. The way she had stood in the rain, fearless, defying his authority without insolence, stirred something dormant in him. He had not been challenged in years, and yet her calm defiance had felt right. Her voice, soft but firm, had cut through the howling storm and settled somewhere deep inside the walls he had so carefully built. It irritated him. It fascinated him. In his study that night, the Duke sat before the fire, his gloved hands clasped, staring into the flames. The storm outside had softened into drizzle, and somewhere down in the stables his injured horse rested, saved by that woman. "Who is she?" he murmured aloud. "She calls herself Miss Eve," replied his steward, an aging man named Hawthorne who had served him since boyhood. "Lives near the cliffs, teaches the village children. They say she came from London some years ago, though no one knows why." "Miss Eve," he repeated, tasting the name like a secret. "A woman alone, living in obscurity. Why?" Hawthorne hesitated. "Perhaps she has her reasons, Your Grace. The world is not kind to women who wish to disappear." The Duke's gaze sharpened. "No, it is not." He rose abruptly, walking to the tall window that overlooked the cliffs. The sea churned below, dark and endless. "Send word," he said at last. "She will be compensated for her assistance." "Compensated?" Hawthorne asked, mildly surprised. "Your Grace, you've never—" "I know what I've never done," Adrian cut in. "Do as I say." When the steward left, silence reclaimed the room. The Duke stood motionless, the flickering light from the fire casting restless shadows across his face. Compensation. The word felt hollow. He could not explain why gratitude seemed inadequate, why he found himself replaying the moment their eyes had met. There had been no fear in hers, only calm, and something that looked dangerously like understanding. For a man who trusted no one, such thoughts were perilous. He poured himself a glass of brandy, downed it in one swallow, and muttered, "Foolishness." Yet even as he said it, he found his gaze drifting toward the window again, toward the faint lights of the village beyond the trees. Somewhere out there, Miss Eve slept, unaware that she had stirred the interest of a man who had sworn never to feel again. And for the first time in years, Duke Adrian Blackthorne felt something other than emptiness. It was not comfort, not peace. It was the faint, unfamiliar pulse of curiosity, and perhaps, beneath it all, the dangerous beginning of hope. The storm had not entirely passed when Evelina woke the next morning. The air was thick with the scent of salt and wet earth, and the waves outside crashed violently against the cliffs below her cottage. She had hardly slept. Her mind kept replaying the moment she had looked into the Duke's cold, grey eyes. She had thought she'd forgotten how to tremble before any man, but those eyes, so full of power and yet so painfully alone, had unsettled her in ways she could not name. She tried to shake the memory as she stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Children from the village were already making their way up the path, their laughter bright against the gloom. She was their teacher, their guide, and sometimes their mother, when the world was too harsh. "Morning, Miss Eve," they called, their boots splashing through puddles. She smiled, forcing her heart to settle. "Good morning, my loves," she replied warmly, though her voice carried a faint weariness. "Mind your steps. The cliffs are still slippery from the storm." As the morning lessons began, the children's voices filled the tiny schoolhouse with joy. Evelina's heart softened as she watched them recite their poems and clumsily traced letters on slates. This was her sanctuary, the life she had built far away from the glittering cruelty of London society. Here, no one whispered her name with scandal. No one remembered that she had once been Lady Evelina Ashcroft, the daughter of a viscount, the woman whose reputation had been destroyed by a single lie. But the past had sharp claws, and she felt it stirring now that she had come face to face with someone from that same world. The Duke of Wexmoor. His name had once been spoken with reverence in the circles she used to inhabit. She knew of his tragedy, his wife's mysterious death, and his self-imposed exile. She had pitied him once, from afar. Now she wasn't sure if what she felt was pity or recognition. As the rain softened to drizzle, a knock echoed through the small schoolhouse door. The children froze, their eyes wide. Visitors were rare here. Evelina wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. A man stood there, broad-shouldered, dressed in fine but weather-worn livery. "Miss Eve?" he asked respectfully. "I come from Wexmoor Hall. His Grace, the Duke, sends his regards and his gratitude." Evelina's breath caught, though she quickly hid it behind a polite smile. "That is kind of his Grace, but unnecessary. The horse is well, I hope?" "Much improved, thanks to your care," the servant replied, handing her a sealed envelope. The wax bore the crest of the Blackthorn family, an obsidian raven clutching a sword. "His Grace insists you accept this token of thanks." She hesitated before taking it. "Tell His Grace I accept his gratitude," she said quietly. "But I require no payment. I did what any decent soul would have done." The servant bowed. "I shall tell him so, miss." As he left, the children gathered around her, curious. "Who was that, Miss Eve?" one little girl asked. Evelina smiled faintly. "Just a messenger, my dear, nothing more." But as she turned the envelope over in her hands, a strange unease settled over her. That night, when the children had gone and the wind began to whisper against her windows, she broke the seal. Inside was not money, but a short note written in bold, elegant script. "Gratitude is often mistaken for charity. I intend neither. You saved what I value. I would thank you properly. A. Blackthorn." Evelina stared at the words for a long moment, her pulse quickening. She knew what such invitations meant in her old world. The powerful did not summon the fallen without reason. "No," she murmured, crumpling the letter slightly. "I will not go back. But fate has a way of mocking human resolve." 2 days later, another knock came, this time louder, more urgent. When Evelina opened the door, she found the same servant, soaked to the bone, his expression grave. "Miss Eve, forgive my intrusion, but His Grace requests your presence at once. His horse took ill again. He asks for none but you." Her heart wavered. Logic told her to refuse. She had fled that world to save herself, yet the part of her that remembered compassion could not ignore the plea. "Very well," she said finally, tying her cloak. "Lead the way." The journey to Wexmoor Hall was long and wet. The woods were dark, the paths winding, and every gust of wind seemed to whisper warnings of what awaited her. When at last the great iron gates appeared through the mist, Evelina felt her breath hitch. The estate loomed before her like a sleeping beast, majestic and haunted. Inside, the Duke awaited her in the grand foyer. His attire was simple but immaculate, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met again, the world seemed to shrink into that single instant. "You came," he said quietly, almost surprised. "You asked?" she replied, her tone calm but distant. "I came for the animal, not for the man." His lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but something close. "I expected no less." As she followed him through the echoing corridors toward the stables, neither spoke further. Yet in the silence between their footsteps, something invisible began to stir, something fragile, forbidden, and utterly inevitable. And in that quiet storm of glances and unspoken thoughts, the Duke realized what he had truly summoned to his lonely hall was not a healer, but a ghost from the world he had tried so hard to forget. The corridors of Wexmore Hall were lined with shadows that whispered of secrets long kept and pain long buried. As Evelina followed the Duke through the flickering candlelight, she couldn't help but feel the weight of eyes upon her, painted eyes from portraits that lined the walls, watching with judgment and melancholy. The silence was so complete that even the sound of her own heartbeat seemed intrusive. She had been inside many noble houses once, in another life, but none had felt as suffocating as this. When they reached the stables, the Duke stopped. The air inside was heavy with damp hay and the nervous scent of horses. The stallion she had tended days ago, a magnificent black creature with a white blaze down his nose, lay restlessly on his side. Evelina's instincts took over. She knelt beside the animal, her voice soft but commanding, her touch sure and practiced. "Fetch warm water," she instructed the stable hand, "and blankets. He's cold." The Duke stood back, arms crossed, watching her work. For years he had lived surrounded by servants who obeyed his every word, but this woman, this stranger, moved with the authority of one who answered only to her conscience. When she pressed her ear to the horse's flank, her brow furrowed with concern, he found himself inexplicably trusting her. "He needs rest, not burden," she said after a moment, rising to face him. "You push him too hard." His gaze darkened, but her tone held no fear. "He's a war horse," he replied. "He was bred for endurance." Even the strongest creature breaks if never allowed to heal," she said quietly. "That is not endurance, it's punishment." Her words landed heavier than she knew. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm outside rumbled faintly, and the Duke's jaw tightened, as if her observation had pierced something he'd rather keep hidden. At last he said, "You speak as though you've known suffering." "I have," Evelina answered, meeting his eyes with quiet strength. "Though not the kind you think." He studied her closely, the flicker of the lanterns casting light across her face. She was beautiful, yes, but not in the fragile, polished way of London's ladies. Hers was a beauty carved from endurance, her eyes reflecting both fire and loss. "London taught me that kindness is a luxury," she continued softly, "and mercy is a weakness. I left before I forgot how to be either." Something in her words struck him like a blade of memory. For the first time in years, Adrian Blackthorne felt the faint stirrings of respect for a woman, for a soul who dared to speak to him as an equal. "Most flee this place the moment they see it," he said, voice low. "They call it cursed." "Perhaps," she replied, glancing around the dim stable, "but curses are often just wounds that refuse to close." He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and gestured toward the manor. "You should rest. You'll catch your death in this cold." "I'll stay until the horse is steady," she said firmly. He hesitated, then nodded once, and left her there, his footsteps fading into the distance. When she was sure he was gone, Evelina exhaled the breath she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed the horse's mane. "You poor soul," she whispered. "You remind me of myself." Hours later, as the fire crackled weakly in the stable hearth, the Duke returned. She had fallen asleep on a pile of hay, her cloak draped around her shoulders, her face peaceful for the first time in years. Something inside him softened at the sight. For so long he had banished tenderness from his life. And yet here it was, fragile, uninvited, breathing quietly before him. He turned to leave, but a voice stopped him. "You watch like a ghost," she murmured without opening her eyes. He froze. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said, finally lifting her gaze to his. "But you live like one, among memories, among regrets." His breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to him so plainly. "You know nothing of my regrets." "Perhaps not," she said softly, "but I recognize them. They look a lot like mine." There was a long, charged silence between them. Two broken souls caught in the quiet of midnight, surrounded by the echoes of lives they no longer lived. Finally, the Duke spoke, his voice hoarse. "If I may ask, what crime did the world charge you with that made you hide here?" Evelina's expression faltered. For a moment, she looked like she might turn away. But then she said, "Loving the wrong man." He felt the air leave his chest. For a brief instant, the walls of Wexmoor Hall, the weight of his own grief, seemed to crumble. They stood there, the Duke and the outcast, bound by silence and the haunting truth that both had once trusted love and been destroyed by it. Outside, the storm began to fade into dawn, and with its dying breath came something that neither dared to name. The invitation came just before sunset. A young maid, cheeks flushed from haste, appeared at the stable door with a curtsy and a note sealed in black wax. Evelina looked up from tending to the horse, who now stood strong and calm, nuzzling her hand with gratitude. "From His Grace," the girl said, her voice nervous, as though delivering a message from a ghost. Evelina wiped her hands on her skirt and broke the seal. Inside, the message was brief. "The hall owes you more than gratitude. Join me for supper. A. Blackthorne." She read the words twice, her pulse quickening despite her best efforts to stay composed. A supper invitation from the Duke himself. This was not mere courtesy. For a man who had turned his back on society to extend such an offer to a stranger, it meant something. But what? "Tell His Grace," she said finally, folding the note, "that I will come if he does not expect conversation." The maid's eyes widened, but she only nodded and hurried away. Evelina watched her go, her heart heavy with a strange mixture of apprehension and curiosity. That evening, as dusk settled across the cliffs, Evelina stood before the mirror in the guest chamber she'd been shown to. She had changed from her simple, teaching gown into a modest navy dress, clean, plain, yet elegant in its quiet dignity. Her hair, brushed loose over her shoulders, caught the faint glow of candlelight. She hadn't dressed for nobility in years. The reflection looking back at her felt almost like a stranger, a woman she had buried long ago. When she entered the dining hall, she froze. It was vast, lined with tall candelabras and portraits whose painted eyes followed her every step. At the far end of a long mahogany table sat Duke Adrian Blackthorne, dressed in black, a single candle flickering beside him. The storm that had haunted the coast for days had finally cleared, and moonlight spilled through the arched windows, bathing the room in silver and shadow. "Miss Eve," he greeted, standing as she approached. His voice was low, smooth, yet uncertain in a way that surprised her. "I hope my invitation was not unwelcome." "I don't believe you extend many," she replied, taking the seat he offered. His lips curved faintly. "That's true. I find company exhausting. Then why endure mine? She asked lightly, though her eyes held him with quiet challenge. He poured her wine, his hand steady. Because for once I am not sure what I will hear, and that, Miss Eve, is something I haven't felt in years. The words unsettled her more than they should have. Conversation between them began haltingly, simple things at first: the sea, the village, the horse. Yet beneath every sentence lingered tension, like a violin string stretched too tight. When he asked about her life in the village, she hesitated. "I teach children," she said simply. "You were not born to such work," he observed. "Your speech, your manner, London, I'd wager." Her gaze dropped to her hands. "London taught me enough to wish never to return." He studied her quietly. "We share that sentiment, it seems." They ate in silence for a time, the only sound the gentle crackle of the fire. Then the Duke spoke again, his tone lower. "You said before that you were punished for loving the wrong man. What did he do to earn your loyalty?" Evelina's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around her glass. "He promised me forever," she said bitterly. "And when forever became inconvenient, he let the world believe I was a thief of hearts and fortune alike. My father disowned me, my friends vanished. My name was whispered in salons as a warning." The Duke's jaw tensed. "And he paid no price for it?" "Men seldom do," she replied softly. "They ruin and they walk away." He fell silent, his eyes darkening with a storm of recognition. Across the table, the weight of their pain bound them tighter than any vow could. At last he said, "I once believed love made a man strong. I learned it only weakens him." "Then you did not love rightly," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Real love never weakens, it reveals." Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Neither breathed. The air between them trembled with something neither dared name. The Duke looked away first, his tone colder now, as if retreating from the edge of something dangerous. "You speak boldly, Miss Eve. It would unsettle most men." "I have met enough men who are easily unsettled," she replied, standing. "I did not think you one of them." Her defiance sparked something alive in him, something that felt alarmingly close to admiration. "You think me heartless?" "No," she said quietly. "Just afraid." He froze. "Of what?" "Of feeling again." Her words struck like lightning. For a moment, the Duke forgot to breathe. He could not recall the last time anyone had spoken to him without fear. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Eve," he said softly. She turned. "Stay, please." There was no command in his tone this time, only sincerity. Evelina hesitated, then nodded once. "Very well, but only as long as you remember that I am not one of your ghosts." He inclined his head, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. "No, you are not." As the firelight flickered between them, both knew something irreversible had begun. Not love yet, but the dangerous stirring of its ghost. The next morning dawned pale and hushed, as if the entire world held its breath over Wexmore Hall. Mist clung to the grounds, wrapping the ancient stone walls in a ghostly veil. Evelina awoke to the sound of distant bells, soft, mournful chimes that seemed to echo from another lifetime. She dressed simply and decided to walk the corridors before breakfast, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity she could not shake. The hall in daylight revealed itself differently. What had been a fortress of shadows now appeared almost fragile, its grandeur faded beneath layers of dust and sorrow. She traced her fingers lightly across the edge of a gilded frame as she passed. Every portrait seemed to whisper a fragment of a forgotten story: kings, soldiers, duchesses long dead. Then at the far end of a narrow gallery, she saw it, a portrait half hidden beneath a draped cloth. Something about its concealment called to her. Slowly she reached up and pulled the fabric aside. The air left her chest. It was a woman, young, fair-haired, her gaze hauntingly alive even in paint. Her expression was serene, but her eyes carried the same loneliness that lived in the Duke's. At the bottom of the frame, the nameplate read, Lady Cassandra Blackthorne, the Duke's late wife. Evelina stepped closer, studying every detail, the delicate curve of the lips, the faint scar just beneath her collarbone, captured in oil with startling precision. Whoever the artist had been, he had loved his subject, for each brush stroke seemed to breathe. But something else caught Evelina's attention, a faint discoloration around the edge of the canvas, near the right-hand corner. Curious, she leaned closer and noticed what looked like a torn piece of parchment wedged between the frame and the wall. She hesitated only a moment before gently tugging it free. It was a letter, aged, brittle, the ink faded but legible. Her eyes moved across the words, and as she read, her pulse began to race. My dearest Adrian, I cannot bear the silence between us any longer. What they say is true. I have been foolish but not faithless. The secret I carry was meant to protect you. If you find this, know that I never meant to betray your heart. Forgive me, and protect him as you once protected me. The letter ended abruptly, torn mid-sentence. Evelina's breath trembled. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, the words filled with desperation and love. Protect him, she whispered. Who? Enough. The voice behind her was low, sharp, and edged with warning. She turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression carved in stone. His eyes, normally so composed, were now storms of anger and pain. You should not be here, he said. I didn't mean, she began. You had no right. His voice thundered through the gallery, echoing off marble and glass. Do you think I parade my ghosts for amusement? Evelina held her ground, though her heart pounded wildly. Then why hide her? She asked quietly. Why bury her behind a curtain if you've nothing to fear? His jaw clenched. Because I do not wish to remember. You remember every day, she said, her voice trembling, but firm. You live inside the ruins of her memory. You think shutting the world out will silence the truth, but pain has a way of finding you, Duke. Pain? He laughed bitterly. You speak of pain as if you know mine. I do, she replied softly, because I've worn it too. The fury in his eyes faltered. Silence stretched between them again, sharp as glass. He stepped forward, his tone lower now, almost pleading. Put the letter back. Why? She asked. It's hers. And it speaks of something you don't know. She tried to tell you something before she died. Something important. He looked away, his shoulders stiff. There is nothing left to tell. She betrayed me. Did she? Evelina asked. Or did you believe what you were told because it was easier than facing the truth? The words struck him like a blade. He turned away, walking toward the window, where the mist pressed against the glass. For a long while he said nothing. Then quietly he spoke. I found her body by the pond. The letter you hold was not there then. Only silence. And in that silence I lost everything that was human in me. Evelina's eyes softened. And yet, something human remains. Or you would not have asked me to stay. He looked at her, his face unreadable. You think I asked you here out of loneliness? No, she said. I think you asked because, for the first time in years, someone dared to see you. For a long, trembling moment, neither moved. The candlelight flickered between them, casting their shadows close, almost touching. "Finally," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "if you value your peace, Miss Eve, stay away from this room. Some truths destroy more than lies ever could." He turned and walked away before she could answer, the echo of his boots fading down the hall. Evelina stood there, the letter clutched to her chest, the painted eyes of Lady Cassandra staring down at her, as if begging her to keep digging. And Evelina knew then, whatever secret had broken this man's soul had not yet finished its story. The night sky shimmered above the quiet gardens of Blackthorn Manor, 1,000 stars glittering like scattered diamonds over the inky canvas of midnight. A cool breeze whispered through the rose bushes, carrying the soft fragrance of white blooms that swayed gently under the moon's silvery glow. The Duke of Ravensshire stood at the edge of the marble fountain, his tall frame cloaked in shadows, his expression unreadable as he stared into the still water. It reflected the image of a man who had spent years hidden behind walls of silence and solitude, a man once untouched by love, now irrevocably changed by it. He heard the soft rustle of silk behind him before she spoke, her voice quiet but certain. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Your Grace." He turned slowly, his breath catching for just a moment as his gaze met hers. Evelyn stood beneath the archway of climbing roses, her pale gown glowing faintly in the moonlight, her hair loose and shimmering like spun gold. She looked ethereal, fragile, yet unbreakable. The very sight of her stirred something inside him, something fierce and unrelenting. "I've been alone for far too long," he replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "But I don't wish to be any more." She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes flickering with both courage and fear. "They still whisper about me," she murmured. "No matter what you say or do, they'll never forget that I was banished, that I carry scandal like a shadow." He moved toward her then, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Let them whisper," he said, his tone deep and resolute. "Let them cling to their lies and gossip. They don't know you as I do. They never saw the strength it took for you to stand tall when the world turned its back on you." His hand reached for hers, rough from years of swordsmanship, yet gentle in its touch. "They call me reclusive, cold, heartless. Perhaps they were right. But if solitude was the price of peace, then meeting you was the cost of my awakening." His words trembled with raw truth, breaking through the armor of restraint that had defined him for so long. Evelyn's heart swelled painfully in her chest, tears glistening in her eyes. "Why me?" she whispered. "You
Could have any lady in the realm, someone untouched by scandal, someone worthy of your name." He smiled faintly, a rare, tender curve of his lips that melted her defenses. "Because none of them would understand the darkness," he said quietly. "None of them would look past the mask and still see the man underneath. You do." The silence between them deepened, filled only by the gentle trickle of the fountain and the sigh of the night breeze. He lifted her hand slowly to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, reverent, unhurried, as though sealing a vow. "Evelyn," he said, her name a prayer on his tongue, "I cannot promise you an easy life. The world will not change overnight, but I can promise you this, you will never face it alone again." The moonlight bathed them in silver as he spoke, his words sinking deep into her heart. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as the outcast, not as the scandal, but as a woman worthy of love, respect, and devotion. When she finally met his gaze again, the distance between them vanished like morning mist. "Then I accept," she breathed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not because I need your title, but because I've come to need you." The Duke's expression softened, his stoic features breaking into something luminous, a rare vulnerability that only she had the power to draw out. He reached for her, pulling her gently into his arms, the warmth of his embrace a balm against the coldness of their pasts. The world around them seemed to fade. No court, no scandal, no judgment, only two souls who had found redemption in each other's brokenness. Above them, the stars shone brighter, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to their union. And as the night wind danced through the roses, carrying their whispered vows into eternity, the Duke lowered his forehead to hers and murmured, "From this night on, you are mine, not as a possession, but as my heart's truth." In that sacred stillness, Evelyn closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe, truly, wholly, that love, once lost, had found her again. The woman once banished from society now stood crowned not by pearls or jewels, but by the devotion of the most untouchable man in England. Together they stood beneath the moonlight, a promise sealed not by power or name, but by the quiet, fierce love that had defied every cruel whisper and every broken rule. The first rays of dawn filtered through the tall, arched windows of Wexmore Hall, spilling across the marble floors and illuminating the grandeur of a place that had long been shrouded in shadows. Evelyn awoke that morning, not in her modest cottage, but in the warmth of the Duke's private chambers, the air thick with the scent of burning oak and fresh linen. Sunlight kissed the curves of the room, highlighting its opulent tapestries and gilded mirrors, symbols of wealth and power that now seemed to matter less than the quiet presence beside her. Adrian lay awake, watching her with an intensity that no words could capture, as though memorizing every detail, the sweep of her hair, the soft arch of her brow, the delicate curve of her lips. In that moment, she realized that for the first time since her exile from society, she was truly seen, not for what she had lost or what she had been forced to endure, but for who she was. "Morning," she whispered, her voice still thick with sleep. He smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that reached his stormy grey eyes. "Morning, Duchess," he said, and the title hung in the air like a fragile promise, impossible yet real. It was no mere formality. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had endured, every scar, every whispered insult, every lonely night. She had become more than a woman saved from exile. She had become someone who could claim her place beside a man who had once turned his back on the world, yet now turned toward her with unwavering devotion. The day unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if the universe itself had paused to allow them the luxury of time. They walked through the gardens together, the dew still clinging to roses and lilies, and for the first time Evelyn saw not a haunted man behind the Duke's grey eyes, but a man capable of joy, capable of trust, capable of love. He told her about his plans to restore Wexmore Hall, not for society or title, but for the children of the village he now quietly protected, the same ones she had nurtured in her absence. And in listening, Evelyn realized that the power he wielded was no longer a weapon to isolate himself, but a tool to bring care and justice to those around them, and that she had a hand in shaping it. When the villagers came to the gates later that day, bearing bread, flowers, and smiles of gratitude, they were met not by a reclusive, brooding Duke, but by a man who had learned humility, courage, and forgiveness. And beside him, walking taller than any whispered scandal could ever allow, was Evelyn, once shunned, now elevated, not by wealth or status, but by the sheer strength of her resilience and the undeniable love of a man who had once sworn never to feel. Children ran to her, embracing her skirts, their innocent laughter ringing through the courtyard. Adrian watched her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, and for the first time in years, the weight of his past seemed lighter. That evening they dined together in the great hall, not in silence or caution, but in the warmth of shared triumph over the cruelties of life. Candles burned low, casting long golden shadows across the portraits of ancestors who had demanded conformity, obedience, and the suffocating weight of legacy. Yet in their eyes Evelina felt something remarkable, approval. Not because she had married a duke, not because she had regained her name, but because she had done it with courage, with grace, and with the unyielding insistence of a heart unbroken by betrayal. When the night finally drew its velvet curtains across the sky, Adrian led her to the balcony overlooking the cliffs and the roaring sea. The wind tousled her hair, carrying with it the scent of freedom, salt, and new beginnings. "Do you believe," he asked softly, "that people can truly change?" Evelyn leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "I believe," she said quietly, "that love can change even the most unforgiving hearts." He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and for a moment, the past, the exile, the betrayal, the whispers, all seemed to dissolve into the vast night. They were no longer a lady scorned and a duke haunted, but a woman and a man who had reclaimed their lives from the hands of fate and cruelty. In that shared silence, beneath the moonlight and the distant crashing of waves, they made a vow, not of perfection, not of wealth or prestige, but of unwavering devotion, honesty, and a love so profound it could not be broken by gossip, grief, or the scars of yesteryears. And so the woman who had once been banished from society became the Duchess of Wexmoor Hall, not merely by title, but by the triumph of her heart and the courage to accept the love of a man who had believed he would never love again. The stars above shimmered in quiet celebration, and for the first time in a long lifetime, both Evelina and Adrian slept, knowing that redemption, love, and destiny had finally found them, and that nothing could ever take it away.